Moving and reading don't necessarily mix. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to kind of the end of April wrap up kind of on my reading, tell you what I've read, talk about the 3 books I finished, the 4th book which I'm about halfway through, and just kind of give you a really brief rundown of those books. So the book I haven't finished reading is The Fate of the Day by Rick Atkinson. Atkinson is a well-respected American historian who writes a lot of really, I think, well-respected books. This is the first book by him I've ever attempted to read. It's the 2nd book in his Revolutionary trilogy. He also has a trilogy about World War II that was published not that long ago. And he is an impressive historian with a real ability to write and to create scenes and put you and immerse you in the world in which events are taking place. And this book has been really an eye-opener for me about Atkinson, and I will definitely read more of his books. And I'll give you my final thoughts on the book and a little bit about more details about how it's set up when I'm finished. I finished 3 books this month. 2 of them were audiobooks, and I want to talk about the one I finished most recently first, and that is The Ministry of Time by Kaliane Bradley. The Ministry of Time was nominated for the Women's Prize. It was on the long list. It didn't make the short list. And, you know, from what I understand, I haven't heard a lot of people say a lot of great things about this book. And that might have prejudiced my thinking about the book to a certain extent. Like I said, I listened to the audiobook here, and essentially what it involves is kind of a speculative fiction world in which the British government has gotten hold of a machine that makes it possible to travel through time. And what they've done is they've gone back in history and picked up people who were going to die just before they died, so that they would have, you know, a relatively small impact on, you know, events in the future. To bring them, to study them, to learn things about them, and to possibly use them for some kind of projects that they might have. So our book focuses on one young woman who is of mixed heritage, Cambodian and English, and she has become what they call the bridge. That's the person who's more or less taking care of and helping one of these people from the past transition into you know, the 21st century. She's the bridge to a man whose last name is Gore, who was a commander on an Arctic expedition who was taken out just before he was about to die. And so as his bridge, they live together. She helps him adjust to things. And if you feel like, hey, this feels like the setup for a romance novel, then you would not be entirely wrong. And this kind of brings me to the thing which, you know, I found to be kind of most frustrating about The Ministry of Time. It didn't necessarily feel like a book that could make up its mind what it wanted to be. The relationship that exists between Commander Gore and the young woman who is his bridge feels like something right out of the 2001 movie called Kate and Leopold with, I believe, Meg Ryan and Hugh Jackman were in it. It's kind of like that aspect, only without all the romantic stuff. Instead, add in a sci-fi kind of thriller-ish plot with some confusing elements of time travel and, you know, for me, an uncertainty about exactly what the resolution was and what certain things meant, and you kind of have The Ministry of Time. There are times at which I think Kaliane Bradley writes some really beautiful sentences, some really good writing, and there are times at which I think, you know, the writing is just serviceable. And while I kind of admire the idea of mashing all these things together to create a novel, it feels a bit forced, and it's hard to know which element she spent the most time on. I will say that the romance element of the novel is probably the most developed and the thing that kind of guides you through. The sci-fi or speculative fiction elements and time travel, I think, are kind of covered in sort of in a less direct way. If you're looking for a book that's going to explain how time travel works, and if you're one of those people who's obsessed about making sure that the elements of time travel work out logically, this book might drive you crazy by not giving you enough of that information. Also possible that I just didn't care about those things and didn't pay that much attention. So, you know, what I would say is, on the one hand, I can kind of understand why it made the Women's Prize long list, because it is ambitious, because there is occasionally, I think, some really good writing. But overall, you know, the book was just kind of meh for me in the end. I felt like there were elements of it that I could predict, that I knew what was going to happen ahead of time. And so, it wasn't the greatest read for me. So the second book that I completed is Three Shades of Blue, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Bill Evans, and The Lost Empire of Cool by James Kaplan. James Kaplan is obviously a music writer with a real interest in jazz, and this is a book I really look forward to. This was a People April read for me that I intentionally picked up because it kind of met the prompt of reading about creative people. In this case, three people again: Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Bill Evans. One of the things that doesn't come up on my channel very much anymore is that for a while I was, quite a jazz enthusiast. I wouldn't call myself an aficionado because I never get really all that deep into things. But I listened to a lot of jazz, and I came to find the jazz I like the most. And the jazz I like the most was actually produced by these three men on the whole. Miles Davis and Bill Evans being probably my two favorite jazz musicians, and a really healthy respect for John Coltrane. So what this book is about is the careers of those three jazz musicians, where they came from, how they developed, what their style was, and then kind of culminates in when they come together to record Miles Davis's album, Kind of Blue. Kind of Blue is kind of one of those, considered to be one of the great jazz albums in history, and it does have three major figures from jazz in the 1950s. This kind of sometimes what's referred to as cool jazz is the jazz music that we're talking about here. And Kind of Blue is easily one of my favorite jazz albums. Like I said, I like Miles Davis a lot. And so when I picked the book up, I read the first 110, 120 pages probably in about a day, which if you've been watching me for a while, that's incredibly quickly for me, that I'm a slow reader. But I was really interested in this topic. It was about something and about people who, I really had an admiration for the art they created. And so I rushed through the first 100 pages, and I believe the book comes in around 420 pages long. And then what happened is that my enthusiasm for the subject became kind of overwhelmed by the book itself. The book is kind of a mess in the sense that it's not strictly speaking chronological, that it chases, rabbits down all kinds of holes in terms of jazz musicians who aren't these three men, in terms of their careers, their relationships, their sex lives, their heroin addictions, their various addictions, and how those things affected them, and then how they came together. And in the process, I feel like Kaplan talks about every single gig these men played together or separately. Every musician they worked with or collaborated with is mentioned. Sometimes they're whole paragraphs, which are just long lists of names of jazz musicians. And if you're not a jazz aficionado, you're not going to know who a lot of those people are. And it really, really, really bogs the book down. I have a feeling, and Lecthan over at, I can't remember the name of his channel, but I'll put it right here, did a review of this book for the BookTube Prize. He's reading nonfiction, and he kind of described it as he thought the author wanted to write a book about a biography of Miles Davis, but there were already those books out there, and so he decided he would make it about something else. And so he tries to pull in all these elements of these three people's lives. So we get to the recording of the birth of Kind of Blue, the album that he puts at the center of this book. And then there are about 130 more pages of After. There's one big chapter which is called After, in which he talks about the careers of all three men. And while 136 pages may seem like a lot, particularly when it's filled, like I said, with gig lists and set lists and albums that are recorded and people each man played with, and we're pursuing each man's life, their addictions, their love lives separately. That may seem interesting. It is, but since he's doing three people, he can't give enough attention to any one. And so there are elements of this that just feel thrown together and rushed there at the end. And I kind of thought to myself, you could have written a really good book if you just ended it with Kind of Blue, then had an afterword and talked about, in brief, some of the things the other men or the men did after that, but make the climax of the novel the recording of Kind of Blue and move on. The stories of heroin addiction are sad and heartbreaking, particularly with Bill Evans. The stories of abuse on the part of Miles Davis and his domestic abuse of the women he was involved with are really mentioned but not discussed as anything in depth, which makes me wonder why you would mention them at all. Feels like Kaplan just mentioned them because he felt like he had to, but he doesn't really take those issues very seriously. And what you end up with is kind of, the book kind of ends up like my review. Just kind of rambling and without a real direction or focus, and that's a shame. If you're really interested in jazz or these three men and that album, I think this is a good book for you. But otherwise, it might be one to avoid. And the last book I read, I also listened to the audiobook of that, and that was Girl in the Band by Kim Gordon. Kim Gordon of the band Sonic Youth, which was kind of alternative before there was alternative music. Kind of post-punk, I can't remember what they call it. I think she called it no-wave music at the time. And this book I found to be really entertaining, and I thought Kim Gordon, who both wrote it and read the audiobook, did a good job. I wasn't a real big fan, never really considered myself a fan at all of the band Sonic Youth. It's one of those bands which kind of passed me by, and to be honest with you, I think that helped me enjoy the book in a way that I might not have if I had been a big fan. If I had been a big fan, I think I would have been looking for specific things, which may or may not have been covered in the depth or detail I wanted. As it is, I found parts of the book to be really interesting and parts to be less interesting. So Kim Gordon and Thurston Moore are more or less the founders of the band Sonic Youth, and they were involved in a romantic relationship and married and had a child. That forms one part of the book. And I have a feeling the impetus for writing the book was Kim Gordon kind of having gone through therapy about this relationship and its end, and this book kind of almost being a product of that therapy. That's kind of what it feels like to me. And so that part of the book I didn't really enjoy. I really enjoyed the parts of the book where she talks about her childhood, growing up in California, her parents, the problem of being the younger sibling of a mentally disturbed brother who the family looks at as kind of like the hope of the future. The family considers to be a genius, and what that does to her and how she emerged from that and came out of that relatively strong. I really like the parts about the New York music and art scene in the 1970s and 1980s, which she was a part of, and was kind of coming of age as potentially an artist, but also a musician. I enjoyed her discussion of Sonic Youth, which she kind of basically said, look, I'm not going to try to cover everything. I'm not going to talk about every gig, every album, and coming off of, this book, that seemed like a really refreshing thing to me. But since I wasn't a real big fan of Sonic Youth, there wasn't something musically or artistically that I want to talk, or that I expect her to talk about, that she didn't. And so I found that part to be really interesting, and it got me listening to Sonic Youth in a more serious way for really the very first time. But when it gets to the parts about Thurston Moore, her husband, cheating on her and leaving her, and to a certain extent, that just felt like fairly boilerplate. Unfortunately, I have to say this is true. Stories of man cheats on wife, man leaves wife for other woman has to pick up the pieces and raise the child. And while I admired Gordon's ability to move on and pursue art in different directions, what I think was just great, the story of the relationship ending, though short, was fairly tedious. It was something that had been foreshadowed much earlier in the book, and so I was a lot less interested in that. One of the things I think is interesting about celebrity memoirs, and I'm going to call this that kind of book, is a lot of people accuse it of name dropping. Well, the truth of the matter is, if you're someone like Kim Gordon, you met a lot of musicians and artists who later went on to be famous. So, we get her talking about a relationship with Danny Elfman, whose band Oingo Boingo kind of launched him into a certain kind of fame, and he scores movies. She's going to talk about meeting Kurt Cobain. She's going to talk about Courtney Love and all these other figures who you might, anticipate are a part of that music scene, particularly in the 1990s. And so all that's there. But, to me, when I read a celebrity memoir, I kind of expect that and probably be disappointed if it wasn't there. Of all the people in the book she mentioned, she has the least kind things to say about Courtney Love, which I found to be really interesting. Even her ex-husband, who cheated on her and left her for another woman, she will admit his strengths, and we'll talk about those things. And particularly is, I think, really praises him as a father. if not as a husband and that kind of thing. But I really was interested in it. I think it was good if you're interested in memoirs about musicians. And if you like Sonic Youth, I think this is a good book to read. I will say, if you're looking for a day by day, album by album, concert by concert discussion of the band, you might be disappointed. But since I wasn't looking for that, I thought the book was good. Anyway, there you go. Some not necessarily great books here that I've reviewed in April, but some interesting books. So let me know if you've read these books or have an interest in these books in the comment section down below. And as always, thank you for watching.